Welcome to the Stories of School Leadership podcast, the podcast where we elevate the voices of and create connections between inspirational leaders from the UK and around the world. I'm Emma Lurie, and thank you for joining me as I share these journeys, inspirations, and stories of education, leadership, and life. In this episode, I'm joined by Stella Odosola, who is an ED&I consultant, and she bravely shares her journey through the education system and into educational leadership. She talks about facing barriers against gender, race and disability. We explore experiences of representation, both from a pupil and staff perspective. And Stella shares some really fascinating insights and recommendations into things that leaders can be thinking about and exploring if they are looking at equality, diversity and inclusion, which is a really important aspect for everybody at the moment. So I hope you find this really interesting. Let's get going. Stella, it's so fantastic to have you with us. Thank you so much for giving up a little bit of your time to share your journey in leadership with us. If you could just tell us who you are, where you're from, and kind of, I guess, just a snippet into what you're doing at the moment, and then we'll track back.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me, Emma. Yes, my name's Stella Odosola. I have spent well over a decade in education, in mainstream. So I worked in the secondary sector as a qualified teacher. I spent the majority of my time as head of departments and heading up, I think, 2 departments in my time. I've now left. Exis has left and now work as an EDI consultant, a senior consultant for a really lovely company called In Diverse Companies currently. And where am I from? I often, when I get asked that question, I'm sort of thinking, what do I answer? I often say I'm originally from Peckham via Lagos, Nigeria. So that would be me. But no, I live just outside of Bromley currently. In the slightly leafier part, so a far cry from my old days in Peckham, where I grew up.
Oh, thank you. Now I've got loads more questions, probably. We'll kind of dig into your, leadership experience, but I always like to be super nosy and track right back to people's own school experience, because for lots of people that had sometimes a slight bearing, positive or negative, on their decision making around going into education. Sometimes completely not, and they just fell into it. But I'd love to know a bit more about your, school career and how it was for you.
Yeah, I think for me, school fundamentally was great. I loved school, absolutely loved school. Made lifelong friends whilst at school. As I mentioned at the beginning, being from sort of hailing from African background or Nigerian background, it was always drummed into us that education before anything else. So we were always taught sort of to aim high, aspire to be bigger, better. 99% wasn't good enough on an exam result, coming home and showing that to parents and carers at home, etc. But no, I absolutely enjoyed kind of high school, moved on and went off to university, studied at Surrey, studied social sciences there, sociology. And then I think just my passion for wanting to impact change and work with young people and sort of understand how I could give back to individuals that look like me, etc. I kind of almost fell into teaching. I think I wanted to always go into that sort of social work, something to do with sort of philanthropy work. I don't know, at one point I wanted to work for an NGO and this sort of thing. So I always knew that I wanted to be amongst people in a place or in a space where I could affect change. And I think probably come 3rd year of university, I went to a careers fair and education or teaching popped up. And I thought, I can do this. I can absolutely do this. I can speak truth into the lives of the young people, and I can affect change positively and kind of ensure that their experiences are all would be as good as my high school experience.
And is that what was it a straight step into it from there?
It was, yeah, literally. So finished my degree and stepped straight into my PGCE. That was an interesting experience in and of itself. It's not at all what you expect it to be. You're almost sort of thrown in at the deep end. Certainly we felt that we were. but it was a huge learning curve, and it was so enjoyable. I think the best part of it for me were the mentors that I had, one in particular who was really, really excellent, and she took me under her wing and she showed me the way. But more than that, the young people, how funny they were, how articulate they were. And I felt at that point, this is me, this is my calling, this is what I'm meant to be doing. I'm meant to be in this space. I'm meant to be here being a positive role model. I don't necessarily remember us having very many, if any, global majority role models throughout my education. And I remember at the time thinking, no, this is the space and this is where you're going to affect change and really make an impact. So so I just stepped straight into the PGC, straight to training, got my first job in a school in South London. Absolutely loved it. The kids were dynamic, they were bubbly, they were little terrors at times, but they were great. They were great, and I was ambitious. I was young. I wanted to do this and that, be a head of department, even ascend to senior leadership, the whole lot. And then life happens, and you get married, you have kids, and you kind of juggle all of that. But throughout the time, I've always known it was the place for me. Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing. I was going to ask you actually once now, and you touched upon it there around seeing that difference between how you felt at school in terms of representation, and I guess seeing yourself in whether that was leaders, I suppose. I don't know whether you can remember feeling, that you had that representation in terms of, I guess, the literature that you were exposed to when you were at school. But I guess you'd kind of touched upon that idea that once you got yourself into being an educator and stepping those stones, you kind of saw the disparity there.
No,
Is
absolutely.
that
And I
true?
think, yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. One thing that I can say is that the diversity within my school experience, for example, was certainly in the student body. What wasn't apparent, and I can kind of look back and see this, that what wasn't apparent is that same diversity in the staff body.
Yeah.
That did not exist for us. And so when you speak about diverse representation by way of text, curriculum, and so on and so forth, that just didn't exist. We probably just followed what was the national curriculum at the time. I do remember one diverse book that we would have read in English, and it was Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. But beyond that, did it look anything like the curriculums that I and colleagues are trying to foster and create and ensure that things were embedded? Absolutely not. So never saw that, never had that representation. And I wonder if now in hindsight that was the motivation. It was to ensure that I was that for the young people in my care.
Yeah. And you mentioned about, I guess, that decision around teaching at that careers fair, thinking, oh, this is something I could do. Do you think consciously that came into your mind that when you were at school, that wasn't how the staff body was, that wasn't a space where you would have maybe completely felt at home, and that was a conscious decision that you wanted to get in there to change things?
I don't know if that was the initial thought when I signed on the dotted line.
I'll just do it. That sounds
Yeah, I just
great.
not the initial thought when I signed up for more student debt, but I think it
Oh,
was there you go. But I think it was very, very apparent when I got into the classroom. As I say, my first school was in Croydon in South London, and it was very, very diverse, as you can imagine, in terms of the student population. And I think the way the students responded and the way that perhaps their eyes would sort of widen when you would walk in the room, or when I first arrived, it was very much indicative of, wow, we have someone that looks like us, that will understand, whether it be our slang, whether it be the foods we talk about, whether it be the experiences that we share, whether it be taking pride in our heritage. We have someone that actually will understand us. So I think certainly that experience within that school, my first teaching role, taught me that, and I think it became very, very pronounced within that setting. And I thought, well, yeah, here we are. This is the reason why.
important to do it. So what happened in terms of steps into leadership? So you kind of talked about the leading departments. Was that something you applied for? Was that something had some people fall into it? What was that leap like for
Yeah,
you?
so when I initially, for me, it was, you're gonna you want to do this, you want to do that. But I think when it came to being head of department, it wasn't something that I was sort of sought out for. It was a role came up within the school, and I applied for it when someone else was on their way out. So I essentially took over from a really excellent head of department that I had, who was a really great mentor, actually. So when she had decided that she was no longer continuing in the role, I think, if I'm correct, I applied for that role and continued sort of leading the department in the way that I knew best and I'd been kind of trained up to do. So what I would say is that, yes, were there instances where there were particular individuals or people being kind of sought out, and as you know, people thinking, not thinking, but people you all know have been sort of earmarked for a role. Was that happening? Yes, certainly. It wasn't the case for me. It was a simple case of applying and then being given the role and then stepping into it and thinking about how I could make it work for me.
And when you think about, I guess that was this at the same school? Was it your experience through the same in the
No,
same
so I think
or
no, I
different?
hadn't actually. Yeah, it was a different school. So at this point, I'd moved over again to a secondary school. But I guess being sort of 20 something and really ambitious, I moved to school with a sixth form because in my mind, I wanted a breadth of experience.
Yeah.
I wanted to, when I ruled the world, I wanted to know that I'd had a bit of experience here, there, and everywhere. So I moved to a new school. The demographic of the students were completely different, so that took some adjusting. But nevertheless, again, still really bright, articulate, dynamic young people. So the kind of shift wasn't necessarily an issue, but it was in a completely new school where I actually was aspiring then to be a head of department, but do so and get the experience at secondary. Sorry, not just secondary, but also A levels and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah. And how was it? How did you find kind of leadership and things that I guess were challenging or motivating? What was that experience like?
I think I would say it was a mixed bag. Um, the closer you got to the closer you got to leadership, the more influence you could have over your curriculum, over the content, as long as you're working within the guidelines. So I taught philosophy and ethics for a number of years, religious studies, philosophy and ethics. As long as you worked within the guidelines of what was prescribed by the local authority, there was huge opportunity to explore a variety of topics. And so leadership allowed me to be able to kind of bring in conversations around race, around LGBTQ plus and so on and so forth, and kind of speak on those matters, but bring it to students from a religious perspective. So we're not here to convert, I'd always say, but we're here to ensure that you understand what tolerance looks like, what belonging looks like, and what faith looks like for different individuals and so on and so forth. So it definitely gave me the flexibility and ability to speak about topics that our students weren't necessarily going to be speaking about in their maths and English lessons, for example. So it did give me that. So I had the autonomy to largely do as I wanted with that part. What was, I guess, to answer your question, what was frustrating about leadership perhaps was sometimes the pace of change. It was sometimes the sense that you wanted to go a lot faster, but as you know, education doesn't necessarily move at the pace that those of us that want to be innovative and dynamic move at. So I think the biggest challenges then were sort of navigating your place within that leadership role, believing in your own voice and believing in your kind of professionalism, maintaining that professional pride and not allowing others to sort of say or tell you that your subject matter or what you're doing isn't right for the young people that I served. I knew the conversations we were having were valid. I knew that they weren't getting this in any other space. And it was just constantly wanting to ensure that you were serving them best while still being a team player with other heads of departments.
Yeah. So was there a pushback and a
I wouldn't
kind
say
of,
I wouldn't say pushback. I would say pace. It was just the kind of pace maybe. I wouldn't
yeah.
necessarily say pushback. I think what we were able to do was within the department and the great individuals that I worked with the entire time, we were able to kind of put our heads down, keep our heads down, navigate the storms of Ofsted inspections and curriculum changes and so on and so forth, as long as we got the results we needed to, which we did. We would often get really top results. And I think it was because of the way that we were able to bring in our students from all levels of ability and kind of have that kind of dialogue and so on and so forth.
I guess that level of autonomy so important to
Mm-hmm.
to feel that you're doing a really great job and to be motivated by the work that you're doing. And I think what we hear a lot at the moment, and I don't know if this is the same in kind of where you're working with others, is that there's a lot of frustration around the autonomy that seems to have been taken away, or lots of people feeling quite squashed by the curriculum expectation, the finances,
Mm-hmm.
accountability. I mean, that's such a big one. So it certainly feels like there's been a shift, over the years. It's getting maybe harder and harder for leaders to be completely autonomous, make those big, brave decisions that shouldn't really be brave, but because you're going maybe against something or making a decision that doesn't sit completely within, the remit of the curriculum, for example, then it feels a bit braver. So you mentioned kind of near the start about somebody who mentored and supported you when you were
Mm-hmm.
training.
Yeah.
Who or what else kind of inspired you, I guess, particularly in that leadership bit, who gave you, you said you were, kind of, you knew what you would do, you were courageous, you very driven. Who were the people who've kind of motivated you during that time?
It's a really good question. I would say, dare I say, it was the people that probably underestimated me.
It's a good
Probably
one.
drove me. Yeah, the people that underestimated me. Because I think that what you would often find is that you do really great work, and you'd kind of, having been at these, certainly the school that I was at for many years, you built up a reputation then of being someone who delivered for the young, for the students, for the school in terms of results, managed your budgets well, and did whatever you needed to. But then when people would often meet you, it would be, oh, it's you, and you're the person that's managed to do all of these great things, for example. So I think it's those individuals who perhaps underestimate you and think that there is, why are you doing this, or why are you taking this approach, and why perhaps are you wanting to go above and beyond versus just doing the standard bits that we're all sort of doing. Why are you challenging in the way that you are? What more do you want other than just to kind of do the business of teaching and learning and then sort of moving on? So I think they certainly would have. The lady I mentioned when I did my initial teacher training, or my PGC at the time, she was like a mother figure for me. I lived away when I did my PGCE, and at the time she found me accommodation. Um, she found me accommodation, and she essentially just kind of mothered me into, threw me in at the deep end, but mothered me into understanding how to kind of navigate this space. She was of African heritage. I think she was a Ghanaian lady, and she was working out in a school in Woking where I trained. So I think she was very acutely aware of being the only one in that space, and wanted to ensure that I did the best I possibly could, because I think for her, when you get the results, then everything else is overlooked, and you aren't penalised for other areas that you might be penalised for. So this is how you learn, this is how you teach, this is just me throwing you in at the deep end and asking you to swim. I think I took that away from teacher training and kind of went head first into my first and then second teaching role.
That's really special, isn't it, to have somebody who you can aspire to see, that they, yeah, can kind of give you that courage to make those bold leaps, I suppose. And yeah, I would completely resonate with the idea that people say you can't. You think, oh, I will show you
I'll tell you.
that
I
I
wonder if
can.
I wonder if it's a Leo thing. It's that, tell me I can't and I'll show you I can, bigger and better.
There you go.
Absolutely.
So I'd love to hear a bit more about, kind of what happened next for you in leadership. So I know, you said right at the start, you're not, school setting at the moment, you work for an organization. So how did that transition happen for you?
I think again it was another bold and inspirational female colleague. So I worked at the school for my second school for 15 years. So I transitioned from head of department and took on an additional TLR as the ED&I lead for the school. And for 2 years, we did fantastic work. It was the first time the role had been advertised or was available post 2020, the events that happened in 2020, when many schools were kind of trying to improve their racial equity work within schools. I applied and I secured that post. And I essentially worked with the school, with colleagues to bring about change and dialogue and conversations that we hadn't ever had in the school around racial equity, around inclusion, belonging, and so on, safe spaces, and so on and so forth, staff training, etc. And again, it was another female member of staff who started at the school and just said, I've never seen this before. I've never seen a school that take this so seriously and have gone as far as appointing someone to this role. As much as I wouldn't want to lose you, you were really talented and perhaps you should really think about doing this full time. And I think for me, it was just that affirmation, or even not affirmation, confirmation that not only have I kind of succeeded with teaching and learning and done a really good job, a solid job, a consistent job there, but I've managed to do that also in this ED&I space, a space that I'm really passionate about and a space that requires people, change makers essentially. And as I say, she was saying to me, yeah, we don't want to lose you, but consider your position here. And so, as I said, I'd spent 15 years at the school. I'd had a family through that time. And you know that, you know, when, I wouldn't say you know when you're not wanted, you know when you've come to the end of the road. You know when perhaps those offers for additional promotion or additional responsibilities aren't coming your way. You know actually when leadership or head teachers are saying, actually, which was really positive, my head at the time had seen a really amazing opportunity as an EDI lead for a local authority. And she said, you'd be amazing for this. Do you want to consider it? It was out of borough. It wasn't feasible with a young family. But I just realised that I wasn't going to continue making the progress I wanted to in this space. I was being told that I was really good doing it. And did you want to consider other alternatives outside of teaching or just stay here? And I did think to myself, yeah, you're absolutely right. Do you want to consider opportunities outside of teaching? Are there any other places or ways that you can affect change in leadership? So I think for me, it was kind of the recognition that leadership doesn't just look like leading from the front, from the classroom, in front of young people, but leadership can also look like exiting the classroom and leading from the front as a governor, as a trustee. So these are other roles that I currently work within, but leading can look like leading and being a specialist in this area also that you're clearly very good at. So again, that's how I kind of pivoted out of education and mainstream into now consulting with ED&I.
I love what you said about that you'd succeeded in the teaching and like leadership, because I think a lot of people who step out of working in a school in a leadership position, I think it's for some people, and I just kind of probably a real historic element is, and this is probably about all careers, isn't it? We kind of see sometimes our jobs as being our forever jobs, and that, you know, if you're in education, you're in it for forever and ever and ever. But I really love how you framed it as a real positive. That's the bit you've done, and it's absolutely sensible to make, you know, other choices. There's lots of other, you know, avenues to explore, which are leadership. And or again, I think
Absolutely.
sometimes when we're teachers and leaders in schools, again, we feel like we can only work in schools, we can only work with young people. And so I sort of, you know, see lots of things online around people who want to step out of teaching or move away from it. And sometimes there's a feeling around that's a failure, that you are, you know, not continuing with that role. But absolutely, there are so many other things that you can do, and which
Absolutely.
utilize all of those skills. Because actually, if you are teaching successfully, like, crikey, teachers are incredible people that can, you know, tightrope juggle, spin
Absolutely.
plates, like they're
Yes.
amazing. So the
Yeah.
transferable skills from education are so vast. I just don't think
So much.
we talk about that enough, and it is very much seen as a kind of forever career, which you, and you a little bit touched upon kind of your thinking that maybe you kind of just keep stepping up the leadership ladder within schools. So
Mm.
I think that's a really interesting reframe. I would
Yeah.
really love to ask you just about your perception of that stepping up. So you kind of touched upon this idea that, you felt that those opportunities weren't coming your way. And do you, and I guess maybe not personally necessarily to you, but just understanding the context of leadership and education, you've talked about what your own school experiences are like in terms of having, diverse staff body. Do you think that's about gender? Do you think that's about race? Both? More than?
Both, both, more than both. Don't get me wrong. What I'm not saying is that education and that space isn't hard work. It absolutely is. And you just described, and we've just described spinning plates and the challenges that come with not feeling perhaps that you're enough and you can step out of education and you're a lifelong educator. I think for me, it's that notion that you are indeed a lifelong educator, but that classroom doesn't need to look like the four walls of a classroom. And that teaching can happen beyond the classroom as well. I think when I speak about my experiences in terms of conquering and succeeding in education, they certainly, I would say in hindsight, were hindered by the opportunities that either I myself didn't feel confident enough to apply for because I didn't see that representation in that space, or that there wasn't those individuals then that were saying, like this colleague had done when she arrived, you can do this. I see so much greatness in you. You can pivot, consider it, come back to me and let's have a conversation. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge the barriers and the systemic barriers that exist. Yes, of course, there are those intersectional barriers. So for me, I'm a Black woman who's neurodiverse. So it's gender, it's race, it's disability, all of those things in one. And I think that, yes, were there barriers? Yes. Were there colleagues that perhaps were being pulled into roles, or roles sort of created, what felt like it certainly, whether it was just my perception or otherwise, felt like roles were being created for them? Yeah, absolutely. What I can say is those things probably were happening, and I don't know if it's perception, but actual fact, those things continue to happen. And I think it's, what I would say is, to leaders who perhaps aren't from the global majority, is believe us when we say these things are happening, and find ways then to invite us into those spaces so that our views, opinions, contributions then can be kind of part of the narrative and can be part of the journey in creating a truly inclusive leadership structure, truly inclusive curriculum and offering in education. So yeah, I'd say it'd be all of those things, gender, race, and being barriers, and they
Yeah.
continue to exist today. Yeah,
Yeah, and
absolutely.
it absolutely does happen. There's so much research and, personal experience just show absolutely it's happening everywhere, and I guess we're talking about it more now, which is positive. And thank you for sharing, because that's absolutely what we need to do. We need to take the lid off and say, yes, this is happening out there. This is something that we need to talk about and elevate the voices of everybody so we can have that better understanding. Because I think yeah, and as before we started recording, I said, I'm sitting here as I'm a female, but I'm white, and I know that I have had very different privileges that have been afforded to me. I live in Devon, it is not particularly diverse, and so for me, I'm really keen and open to learn about the things that we could be doing, should be doing differently, and the start of that is having those conversations, isn't it? And being open to learn and be asking, what is it that would help us to create less barriers, no barriers, ideally, to our spaces.
Absolutely. And I think what comes to mind there, Emma, is a quote that I often band about. It's sort of do the best you can until you kind of know better. And when you know better, you do better. I can't take credit for that. That's a great Maya Angelou on that. But it is that conversation piece around how can individuals do the best they can, but certainly when equipped with the knowledge that these barriers exist, how can they then go ahead and do better in ensuring then that they are not perpetuating those things. So we already know then that when it comes to initial teacher training, there are huge disparities in who the individuals that are getting places on the courses. those disparities widen in terms of teachers within the classroom, they further widen they further widen in terms of leadership. Female global majority leaders or head teachers account for less than 5% of the population. So who do people like myself look up to? Who do aspiring leaders look up to when we're just not there and we've just not been invited into the spaces? So I think for me, it's also thinking about, well, if we're not invited, then again, it's how do we get in to those spaces by different routes? And it doesn't just have to be teaching and learning. It's going into sort of governance, for example, looking at other ways in.
And I love how you shared a little bit about that idea that, yeah, the leadership is widespread and that you can affect change from different points. So tell us more about what you do now, and because that's exactly what you're doing. You've said, okay, I'm going to take some different angles at this, because you're still really passionate about affecting that change.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the first thing for me was sort of the notion that let's not complain about it, let's just do something about it. So when my youngest child started school, again, I don't live in the most diverse, well, the school she went to was not the most diverse at all. And I think for me, it was rather than sort of complaining about it or sort of looking at it as a negative, how do you get involved? How do you get involved and ensure then that your voice is heard? How do you get involved so you understand the mechanics behind what happens within schools? So straight away, I was just thinking about, right, so how can I play my part in my community? How do I best serve underserved and represented groups? So I straight away then applied to be a school governor. I was a school governor probably about 2 years before I was invited then to be a trustee. And now I sit on a local MAT board as their trustee, responsible for ED&I and also education and standards. And I think it's just kind of working out how you can plug into those places and utilise those skills that we become accustomed to or have become accustomed to using and spinning whilst in mainstream education. So again, it's just going back to that notion that yes, leadership can look differently to different people, and education in its traditional form doesn't have to be a lifelong thing where you're in at 20 whatever qualifying age and you kind of retire at 65. I don't think I'd have the energy at 50 to still be in the classroom. So it's just thinking about how you can kind of pivot to that. So for me, that looked like leaving education, going into, and I spent some time in FEHE as an ED&I lead there, but predominantly, and for the last sort of, I don't know, I'd say about 7 years, I've spent time in governance and as a trustee. And again, that gives you a different perspective altogether and a different place of influence. And that's your sphere of influence then changes, your ability to then kind of be that individual in the room to signpost and to signpost and to highlight things that aren't necessarily being seen or recognised. Especially when you're the only person perhaps that might look like me or come from a global majority background or have the experience of ED&I. So that's been really good. And then I've now professionally moved full-time into ED&I as an ED&I consultant. As I say, I've only been doing that job since January, and that's been an eye-opener again in terms of the learning curve, in terms of finding your place within it, finding your voice as an expert in this field, standing in that and just knowing that, yes, you've succeeded previously and you're going to do the same in this space also. And how can you be a visible ally, but also sort of hold fast to the things that you're passionate about. I'm really passionate about anti-racism, really passionate about kind of driving school improvement. It's just using my voice in a different way.
Amazing. So what does your day look like? What sort of things do you do within your, it's called InDiverse, is it the company you work for?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. So it ranges. We've got a whole host of clients, whether it be private, public, and international clients, that we essentially do a range of work from inclusive leadership right through to staff training, charters, you name it, we do it. A lot of bits we are working on, we can't really speak on because they're still.
Oh yeah, don't tell any secrets. Just general is fine. Don't we get into any trouble?
But yeah, no, not at all. But no, honestly, it is really refreshing to be in a space now that you feel that you are kind of unlocking passion, capabilities, and driving change. And don't get me wrong, of course, there are those leaders who are doing this ED&I work because other people are, and they're doing this work because they feel that it's the right thing to do. It will kind of impress on their social media and so on and so forth. It kind of feeds them in a different way, not for the right reasons. And so that's disappointing when you meet and come across those individuals who just aren't in it for the right reasons. But in the main, I truly believe then that people want to do the right thing, are keen to do the right thing, and are keen to engage for the betterment of the teams and people around them. So it's all for me about that sort of creating those non-judgmental spaces, being unconditionally positive and empathetic, and just kind of driving with kind of courageous inclusivity, and asking those challenging questions.
And do you think for those, I guess it's probably individuals, it's probably organizations, isn't it, who are maybe saying, putting out there that, they are working towards more inclusive spaces or, whatever it is that they are advertising, I suppose. If you think that's mainly around a lack of understanding or quite shallow understanding about what they need to be doing. So they're just
Yeah.
kind of picking a couple of different elements and hoping that will be enough and not really understanding, as you've touched upon the kind of systemic issues that we currently have.
Absolutely. I think it's simply just that. It's sort of, it's not doing the real work as I describe it. It's using, are they leaning on data? When asked how do we sort of win hearts and minds, when I asked that recently, I sort of said, go back to the data. What is the data telling us? What is the data telling us on a national pitch on a national front? What's the data telling us within your organisation? And then work backwards from there. If you're finding that your board is indeed, or everyone on the leadership is pale, male and stale, then actually what does that tell us about the diversity of thought and being and presence and movement and the trajectory forward, when especially from leaders who are working in and around London, which is the main kind of areas that I've worked in or lived in or schooled in, etc. If the student body or the staff body looks one way, the leadership looks another, that's there's a problem there.
Yeah.
There's a problem, and if you can't see that, then that's in and of itself a problem. So not looking at the data, not looking at what sort of I don't know, the reports that are coming out all the time from think tanks like the Runnymede Trust and so on and so forth. Not doing those things, I think, is detrimental to the progress of us all. And I think for me, raising two young daughters, I want to ensure that I'm doing my level best, that when I leave the earth, they have been left in a good place. And I'm sort of so inspired by young people and their kind of the bravery and tenacity and their ability to challenge and ask questions and require us to come up with the answers for their good. I just want to keep doing that and driving those conversations.
Yeah, well, I can already see the legacy, part of the legacy that you've made in a short space of time. So I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, so don't feel like you have to answer lots of ideas. But I would, from a personal perspective, and because I think people really like to hear who, I guess, people to follow on LinkedIn to get involved with, or organizations to explore if we want to do further reading. Have you got any recommendations? I mean, I know that it's kind of vast, but are there things that you really enjoy, I guess, sharing with people?
I think if I was speaking from an education perspective, so going back into being
Yeah.
in schools, I think some of the organisations I worked with there or tapped into were Lit in Colour. So what we already know then from the Lit in Colour programme is that at GCSE there are sort of around 1% of students being able to access and study books from global majority writers. So the Lit in Colour programme that I worked on or facilitated kind of bringing into the school then was this program to get diverse books into schools and onto the curriculums. And so whilst there is less flexibility at, let's say, GCSE and A-level, we had huge scope at Key Stage 3 for our students then to read a range of diverse books. We had an excellent librarian at the time who would kind of buy in everything I would suggest. So I would say sort of the Lit and Colour programme, if you're not already part of it, get involved. I'd say the Black Curriculum is another one. The Runnymede Trust when it comes to sort of think tanks and data and so on and so forth. When it comes to governance, I think just if you are able to and you can get involved at those local levels in terms of finding out what's really going on behind the scenes within schools, not because you want it to look great on your CV and kind of take up your volunteer hours, but really because you have a vested interest in not only your child's progress, but also the progress of all the kids at school. So get involved. For example, I probably go back to, I was on a call with the National Black Governors Network last week. So get involved with organisations like them in terms of, again, if you come from a global majority background, because I guess my view would be, again, it's just that how I've been raised, isn't it? It's not complain about it, just do something about it. So if that representation doesn't exist, if you're not happy with the curriculums, if you're not happy with how things are working, operating, the lack of representation, if you have that lived experience, if you can create inclusive spaces, if you're able to have meaningful conversations with leaders in those spaces, get involved in governance, get involved as a local school governor, for example. So it's just thinking about how else can we as teachers either stay within mainstream or exit left, still use all of those transferable skills, still have an impact, still work with young people, which usually is why we go into it, isn't it? Just go in and make a difference.
Absolutely. Stella, thank you so much for your time. It's been really incredible to speak to you and hear your experiences. And yeah, like you said, if as many people possible are making those decisions to step in and make some change, then the needle will shift. Like we will step forward and things will move along. It's just taking everybody to make those decisions. Thank you so much for your time.
Will move us along, won't they? We'll really let them down when we don't do our bit. So yeah, absolutely.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been really fantastic.
Thanks for having me, Emma.
Thank you so much for listening to the Stories of School Leadership podcast. We'd love to know what inspired you in this episode, so do get in touch and tell us your thoughts. And please share this with friends and colleagues. If you have time, a review would mean so much. It really helps us to reach more people. If you'd like to connect with me to follow my journey or access some support, maybe supervision, coaching or early years consultancy, you can find me at Stories of School Leadership on Instagram. I'm Emma Lurie on LinkedIn, or my website is emmalurie.co.uk. I hope you have a great day whatever you're getting up to next, and I can't wait to share the next episode with you.